The stone walls of Lunaria's servants' quarters had grown cold with the approaching autumn, and Lyra pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders as she scrubbed the last of the evening's dishes. The kitchen was finally empty, the other Omega servants having retired to their shared chambers. But Lyra lingered. These stolen moments of solitude were precious, the only time she dared to let her guard down. She hummed softly under her breath, a melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her chest, resonating through her bones. It was an old tune, one her mother had sung to her before the purge that left so many Omegas orphaned and scattered across the kingdom's great houses as servants. "Always keep your voice small, little moonbeam," her mother had whispered during those final days when they hid in the forest caves. "A loud Omega draws the wrong kind of attention." Lyra had obeyed that advice for 8 years now, serving silently in King Darius's castle, invisible among the dozens of Omegas who cooked, cleaned, and tended to the needs of the Alpha nobility. At 22, she had perfected the art of being overlooked, hunched shoulders, downcast eyes, voice barely above a whisper when forced to speak. The sound of heavy boots on stone made her freeze mid-hum. She quickly busied herself with wiping down the already spotless counter as Alpha Marcus, the head of the castle guard, entered the kitchen. His dark eyes swept the room before settling on her, and Lyra fought the instinctive urge to bow deeper. Marcus had always made her uncomfortable. His gaze lingered too long, and his smiles held promises she wanted no part of. "Still working, little Omega." His voice carried the natural authority of an alpha, but there was something else beneath it that made her skin crawl. "So dedicated. I've been watching you, you know." Lyra kept her eyes fixed on the stone counter. "I was just finishing up, Alpha Marcus. I'll retire now." "Not so fast." He moved closer, close enough that she could smell the wine on his breath and the heavy musk of his alpha scent. "King Darius is planning something special for tomorrow's victory banquet. He wants to entertain his guests." Her blood turned to ice. Victory banquets were notorious for their cruel games, often involving the humiliation of servants for the amusement of the noble alphas and betas. She had heard whispers of previous banquets where Omegas were forced to perform ridiculous tasks, paraded around like trophies, or worse. "The king has heard rumors," Marcus continued, circling her like a predator stalking prey, "that some Omega in his castle can sing. He finds the idea amusing, wants to see just how pathetic an Omega's attempt at music truly is." Lyra's hands trembled as she gripped the washcloth. Someone had heard her. Someone had told the king about her secret humming, her private moments of solace. The very thing her mother had warned her about was happening. I don't know anything about singing, Alpha Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible. His laugh was sharp and cruel. "Oh, but I think you do, little moonbeam." The childhood endearment from her mother's lips sounded like a curse in his mouth. Lyra's eyes shot up to meet his, and she saw the gleam of satisfaction there. He knew. Somehow, he had discovered her secret. "Tomorrow night," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper, "you will sing for the king and his guests. You will embarrass yourself thoroughly, and they will laugh at the foolish Omega who thought she had a voice worth hearing. And if you refuse—" He let the threat hang in the air, but the implication was clear. Refusal meant worse than humiliation. It meant death. As his footsteps faded down the corridor, Lyra collapsed against the stone counter, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The melody that had been her comfort, her last connection to her mother, had become a trap. Tomorrow night, she would be forced to break the most important promise she had ever made. But as the moon rose full and bright outside the kitchen window, something stirred deep within her chest, a resonance that was more than just melody, more than just voice, something that had been sleeping for 8 long years, waiting for the right moment to wake. 30 verse Martha chapter 2, The King's Command. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the controlled chaos of banquet preparation. Lyra moved through her morning duties like a ghost, her mind trapped in an endless loop of dread. Every time she tried to focus on her tasks, polishing silver, arranging flowers, helping prepare the elaborate feast, her thoughts returned to the coming evening. The great hall was being transformed into a spectacle, worthy of King Darius's reputation for excess. Banners bearing the royal wolf insignia hung from the vaulted ceiling, while servants positioned elaborate candelabras and arranged seating for nearly 200 guests. The victory being celebrated was the king's brutal suppression of the Eastern Pack Rebellion, a conflict that had left hundreds dead and entire families scattered to the winds. Lyra. The sharp voice of head housekeeper Marta cut through her anxious thoughts. The older beta woman stood with her usual stern expression, clipboard in hand. "You're to report to the king's study immediately. Do not keep His Majesty waiting." The walk to the upper levels of the castle felt like a march to execution. Lyra's bare feet made no sound on the cold stone steps, but her heart thundered so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The king's study was in the highest tower, a place where servants rarely ventured and from which few emerged unchanged. 2 alpha guards flanked the massive oak door, their expressions impassive as they watched her approach. One knocked twice before opening the door without waiting for a response. "The Omega, Your Majesty." King Darius sat behind an ornate desk carved from black walnut, his silver-streaked hair gleaming in the afternoon light streaming through tall windows. At 53, he remained an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of predatory grace that reminded everyone why he had held the throne for over 2 decades. His golden eyes, the mark of his royal bloodline, fixed on Lyra with calculating interest. "Ah, the little songbird," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of noble breeding mixed with barely contained cruelty. "Do you know why you're here, Omega?" Lyra kept her gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the Persian rug beneath her feet. "Alpha Marcus said you wished me to sing at tonight's banquet, Your Majesty." The king's laugh was like breaking glass. "How delightfully simple you make it sound. Yes, I want you to sing, but not just any song. I want you to choose something that showcases the limitations of your kind. Something that will demonstrate to my guests why Omegas are suited only for service, not for the finer arts." Behind the king, Prince Kieran stood near the window, his dark silhouette cutting a sharp line against the bright sky. Lyra had seen the prince from a distance many times, 28 years old, unmarked, and possessed of a reputation that made even seasoned alphas speak his name with respect. Unlike his father's golden eyes, Kieran's were storm grey, and when he turned from the window to study her, she felt as though he could see straight through to her soul. "Father," Prince Kieran's voice was deeper than the king's, rougher, with an edge that spoke of battles fought and won. "Perhaps this is unnecessary. The Omega clearly doesn't want to perform." "That," King Darius said with evident pleasure, "is precisely what makes it so entertaining. The reluctant performer, the Omega who thinks herself above her station. It's perfect." The king rose from his chair and moved around the desk with predatory grace. Lyra forced herself to remain still as he circled her, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "I've heard whispers about you, little Omega. They say you sing when you think no one is listening. They say your voice has unusual qualities." He paused in front of her, close enough that she could smell his alpha scent, dominant, overwhelming, designed to make Omegas submit. "I'm curious to see if these rumors have any truth to them, or if you're just another delusional servant who's forgotten her place." "Your Majesty," Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible, "I am nothing special. I'm just a servant. I don't know why anyone would say otherwise." "Modest?" The king's smile was cold as winter frost. "How refreshing. Very well, here are your instructions. Tonight, after the feast, you will perform. You may choose your own song. I'm feeling generous. You will sing loudly enough for every person in that hall to hear you clearly. And when you inevitably fail to meet even the lowest expectations, when your voice cracks and your courage fails, my guests will see exactly why Omegas should never aspire beyond their natural limitations." The cruelty of it was breathtaking in its completeness. He wasn't just demanding she sing. He was orchestrating her public humiliation, using her as a cautionary tale about Omega ambition. "If you refuse," the king continued conversationally, "I will assume you are in league with the Eastern Pack rebels. Treason, as you know, is punishable by death, a slow public death." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire in the stone hearth. Through the window, Lyra could see the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, marking the approach of evening and her moment of reckoning. "I understand, Your Majesty," she whispered. "Excellent." King Darius returned to his chair with obvious satisfaction. "Prince Kieran will escort you back to the servants' quarters. I suggest you spend the remaining hours choosing your song carefully. Tonight, you will either prove the natural inferiority of your kind, or you will die trying to do otherwise." As the heavy door closed behind them, Lyra found herself walking beside Prince Kieran through the castle's labyrinthine corridors. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words, until finally the prince spoke. "He's hoping you'll fail," Kieran said quietly, his grey eyes fixed straight ahead. "My father enjoys breaking things he considers presumptuous." Lyra said nothing, but something in her chest began to burn. Not the ice-cold fear that had gripped her since last night, but something hotter, something that felt dangerously close to defiance. Tonight, she would sing. The question was no longer whether she would survive it, but whether King Darius would survive what he had awakened. Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. The hours between the king's command and the evening banquet passed in a blur of anxious preparation. Lyra's hands shook as she helped arrange the final decorations in the great hall, each task feeling surreal against the backdrop of her impending performance. The other servants seemed to sense something was wrong. They gave her worried glances and gentle touches on her shoulder, but none dared ask what troubled her. In King Darius's court, curiosity could be deadly. As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, the guests began arriving. Through the tall windows, Lyra watched elegant carriages pull up to the castle's main entrance, their occupants emerging in waves of silk, velvet, and precious metals. The most powerful alphas from across the kingdom had come to celebrate their king's victory over the eastern rebels, and the air itself seemed to thicken with their combined dominance. Alpha Lord Brennan of the Northern Territories arrived with his mate, Lady Celeste, their matching silver circlets catching the torchlight. Behind them came Alpha Duchess Ravenna from the coastal regions, her midnight blue gown sweeping dramatically behind her as she ascended the stone steps. Each arrival brought with them their own entourage of betas and a carefully selected handful of omegas, perfectly groomed and silent, serving as living proof of their master's status and power. Lyra retreated to the kitchens as the great hall filled with laughter and conversation. The feast would last for hours before King Darius called for entertainment, giving her time to prepare for what might be her final performance. She found a quiet corner behind the massive stone ovens and closed her eyes, trying to center herself as her mother had taught her during those long nights in the forest caves. "Focus on your breath, little moonbeam. Let the music flow from your heart, not your fear." But how could she separate the two when fear had been her constant companion for so long? For 8 years she had lived in the shadows, making herself small and invisible. Now she was being thrust into the brightest spotlight possible before an audience that expected her to fail spectacularly. "There you are." The familiar voice made her jump. Mira, one of the kitchen omegas and perhaps Lyra's closest friend among the servants, approached with a concerned expression. At 19, Mira still retained some of the optimism that life in the castle usually crushed within the first year. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, but rebellious curls framed her heart-shaped face. "Everyone's talking about tonight," Mira whispered, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "They say the king is going to make an example of someone. Please tell me it's not you." Lyra couldn't meet her friend's eyes. "I have to sing for the king's guests." The color drained from Mira's face. "Oh, Lyra, no, why would he choose you?" "Someone heard me humming. Someone told him I could sing." The words came out bitter and broken. "He wants to humiliate me in front of the entire court. Show them what happens to omegas who forget their place." Mira's eyes flashed with an anger that was dangerous for an omega to display, even in private. "That's not fair. You have a beautiful voice. I've heard you when you didn't know I was listening. You shouldn't have to hide something so lovely. Beautiful voices don't matter when you're born omega, Mira. You know that as well as I do." They sat in heavy silence for several minutes, the sounds of the feast drifting down from the great hall above, laughter, clinking glasses, the occasional howl of appreciation as particularly entertaining stories were shared. This was the world of alphas and betas, a world where omegas existed only to serve and submit. "What will you sing?" Mira asked finally. Lyra had been wrestling with that question all afternoon. King Darius expected her to choose something that would highlight her inadequacies, but every song she considered felt like a betrayal of everything her mother had taught her. The lullabies her mother sang carried melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than mere human memory. The work songs the omegas hummed while they labored held rhythms that spoke to something primal and ancient. None of these felt appropriate for a performance designed to showcase omega inferiority. "I don't know," she admitted. "Nothing feels right." "Then don't give them what they expect," Mira said suddenly, her voice intense. "If you're going to be punished either way, Why not sing something true? Something that honors your mother's memory instead of mocking it? Before Lyra could respond, the sound of footsteps in the corridor made them both freeze. Alpha Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, his predatory smile even more pronounced than usual. Behind him stood two beta guards, their hands resting casually on their sword hilts. "Time to go, little songbird," Marcus said, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "The king is ready for his entertainment." Lyra rose on unsteady legs, Mira's words echoing in her mind. "Something true, something that honors your mother's memory." As the guards flanked her and Marcus led them toward the great hall, she made her decision. She would not sing a song chosen to diminish her. If this was to be her last performance, she would make it count. But Chapter 4. The Omega's Defiance. The great hall had been transformed into a glittering spectacle of wealth and power. Hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, while the massive fireplace roared with flames that seemed to reach toward the vaulted ceiling. The long tables groaned under the weight of the feast, roasted meats, exotic fruits, fine wines that had traveled from the far corners of the kingdom, but it was the guests themselves who truly commanded attention. Nearly 200 of the most powerful wolves in Lunaria had gathered to celebrate King Darius's victory, and their combined presence created an atmosphere so thick with alpha dominance that Lyra could barely breathe. She had never been in the same room with so many high-ranking wolves before, and the weight of their collective authority pressed down on her like a physical force. At the head table on the raised dais, King Darius held court in his golden chair, regaling his closest allies with detailed accounts of the Eastern Rebellion's suppression. To his right sat Prince Kieran, whose storm-grey eyes seemed to scan the crowd with the constant vigilance of a warrior. To the king's left, Alpha Lord Brennan raised his wine goblet in yet another toast to their host's military prowess. Alpha Marcus guided Lyra to a small area that had been cleared near the center of the hall, directly in front of the high table. A single chair had been placed there, not for her, she realized with growing dread, but for King Darius to have the best possible view of her humiliation. She was meant to stand in that open space, exposed and vulnerable, while hundreds of the kingdom's elite watched her fail. "Ladies and gentlemen," King Darius's voice cut through the conversation like a blade, commanding instant silence. "We have enjoyed a magnificent feast in celebration of our recent victory over the traitorous Eastern Pack. But no celebration is complete without entertainment." A ripple of anticipatory laughter ran through the crowd. Many of these nobles had attended the king's banquets before and knew what entertainment typically meant. Elaborate humiliations designed to remind everyone present of the proper social order. "Tonight," the king continued, rising from his chair with theatrical grace, "we have a special treat. It has come to my attention that one of my castle's Omega servants believes herself capable of song. I thought it might be amusing to allow her to demonstrate this supposed talent." The laughter grew louder, cruel and hungry. Lyra felt hundreds of pairs of eyes turning toward her, some amused, others curious, all expecting to witness her complete degradation. Her knees threatened to buckle under the weight of their collective attention. "Come forward, little Omega," King Darius commanded, his golden eyes gleaming with malicious pleasure. "Share with us this gift you've been hiding." The walk to the center of the cleared space felt like miles. Each step echoed in the sudden silence, and Lyra could hear nothing but her own thundering heartbeat and the whisper of her simple dress against her legs. When she reached the designated spot, she turned to face the high table and found King Darius watching her with the expression of a cat playing with a mouse. "Well?" he prompted. "We're waiting." Lyra's mouth was dry as sand. She tried to speak, to begin the song she had chosen, but no sound emerged. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable, then painful. She could feel the crowd's amusement shifting toward impatience, could sense their bloodthirsty anticipation of her collapse. "Perhaps," called out Alpha Lord Brennan from the high table, "the little Omega has realized she's out of her depth." More laughter, sharper now and edged with cruelty. Someone in the crowd made a joke about Omega delusions that Lyra couldn't quite hear over the rushing in her ears. This was exactly what King Darius had wanted. Public proof that Omegas who reached beyond their station would inevitably humiliate themselves. But then, cutting through the mockery like a silver thread, came a memory. Her mother's voice on that last night in the caves, singing a lullaby that seemed to make the very stones around them hum with harmony. It was an old song, older than the kingdom itself, passed down through generations of Omegas who had found strength in music when the world offered them none. Lyra closed her eyes, blocking out the hostile faces and cruel laughter. She thought of her mother's hands braiding her hair by moonlight, of quiet moments stolen between chores when melody had been their only freedom. She thought of Mira's words, "Sing something true, something that honors your mother's memory." When she opened her mouth this time, sound emerged. Not the weak, trembling voice everyone expected, but something deeper and richer, carrying notes that seemed to come from the very core of her being. In the moonlight's silver glow, ancient songs begin to flow through the forest, through the stone, "Never shall we walk alone." The effect was immediate and electric. The laughter died as if cut by a knife, and the great hall fell into a silence so complete that the crackling of the fire seemed deafening. Lyra's voice rose and fell with the melody, each note perfectly clear and hauntingly beautiful, carrying emotions that touched something primal in every wolf present. But it was more than just beauty. As her voice gained strength and confidence, something else began to happen. The very air in the hall seemed to shimmer, and Lyra felt power flowing through her. Ancient power, Omega power that had been suppressed for so long that most had forgotten it ever existed. Daughters of the moon and star, sisters both near and far, in our hearts the music dwells, breaking chains and casting spells. The stones of the castle itself seemed to respond to her song, creating an almost imperceptible harmony that made every person in the hall feel the music not just in their ears, but in their bones. Several of the Omega servants who had gathered in the doorways to watch began to weep, recognizing something in the melody that spoke to memories buried so deep they had almost forgotten them. Prince Kieran leaned forward in his chair, his storm-grey eyes fixed on Lyra with an intensity that was different from everyone else's shock. While the other nobles sat frozen in amazement, he seemed to be listening not just to her voice, but to something else, something in the music that called to him in ways he couldn't understand. As the final notes of the lullaby faded into silence, Lyra opened her eyes to find nearly 200 of the kingdom's most powerful wolves staring at her in absolute stillness. For a moment, that felt like an eternity. No one moved, no one breathed, no one spoke. Then King Darius slowly rose from his chair, his face pale and his golden eyes burning with something that was no longer amusement, but fear. "Seize her," he commanded, his voice cutting through the spell her song had woven. "Seize the witch and throw her in the dungeons." Chapter 5. Chains of Stone and Silver. The dungeons beneath Castle Lunaria were carved from living rock, their walls weeping with moisture that never dried and echoing with the whispers of those who had been forgotten by the world above. Lyra's cell was small and windowless, furnished only with moldy straw and iron shackles that had been forged specifically to suppress supernatural abilities. The metal burned against her wrists like liquid fire, designed to contain creatures far more dangerous than a simple Omega servant, or so they thought. 3 days had passed since the banquet, 3 days since her song had shattered the carefully maintained illusion that Omegas were nothing more than subservient shadows. The guards who brought her meager meals, thin gruel and stale water, refused to meet her eyes, their fear palpable even through the thick iron bars. Word of what had happened in the Great Hall had spread throughout the castle like wildfire, and every whispered conversation seemed to carry her name. Lyra sat in the corner of her cell, her back against the cold stone wall, trying to process what had happened to her. The song she had sung was her mother's lullaby, passed down through generations of Omega women, but she had never felt anything like the power that had flowed through her that night. It was as if something long dormant had awakened, something that made the very foundations of the castle resonate with her voice. The iron shackles were meant to prevent her from accessing whatever force had emerged during her performance, but they couldn't silence the music that lived in her heart. Even now, humming softly under her breath, she could feel vibrations traveling through the stone around her, carrying her melody to places the king's guards couldn't reach. Footsteps in the corridor outside her cell made her look up. These weren't the heavy boots of the guards who brought her food, but lighter steps, more cautious. A hooded figure appeared outside her cell, and when they pulled back the hood, Lyra gasped in recognition. Prince Kieran stood before her cell, his storm-grey eyes intense in the flickering torchlight. He wore simple, dark clothing instead of his usual noble attire, and a set of keys hung from his belt, keys that could only have been stolen from the dungeon master. "Your Highness," Lyra whispered, scrambling to her feet despite the weight of the shackles. You shouldn't be here. Neither should you, he replied quietly, his gaze taking in her disheveled appearance and the angry red marks where the iron had burned her skin. My father has ordered your execution at dawn. The words hit her like a physical blow, though she had expected as much. King Darius couldn't allow what she represented to live, not when her very existence challenged the foundations of his rule. "Why are you here?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Prince Kieran was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. "That song you sang, I've heard it before. That's impossible. It's an Omega lullaby, passed down through my maternal line. No Alpha would know it. My mother sang it to me when I was a child," he said softly, and Lyra felt the world tilt around her. "Before she died, before my father forbade anyone from speaking her name in the castle, she was Omega, wasn't she?" The question hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Queen Elena had died when Prince Kieran was 7 years old, officially from a wasting sickness that the court physicians couldn't cure. But Lyra had heard whispers among the older Omega servants, stories they thought no one was listening to, about a queen who had loved her people too much and paid the ultimate price for her compassion. "I don't know," Lyra said honestly. "I was just a child when she died. But the song, if she sang it to you, then she must have learned it from someone who carried the old traditions." "The old traditions," Kieran repeated, moving closer to the cell bars. "What do you know about them?" "Only fragments, stories my mother told me before she died. She said that long ago, before the Great Suppression, Omegas weren't just servants and breeders. They were the keepers of the ancient magic, the bridge between the mortal world and the forces that govern the moon and tides. Their songs could heal the sick, calm storms, and—" She hesitated, unsure if she should continue. "And what?" "And call the wolves home to their true nature. Strip away the lies and politics and remind them what it means to be part of the pack." Prince Kieran's hands gripped the iron bars, his knuckles white with tension. "Is that what you did at the banquet? Called us home?" "I don't know. I just sang the song my mother taught me, the way she taught me to sing it. I didn't expect—" She gestured helplessly at her surroundings. "The entire court felt it," Kieran said urgently. "Every Alpha, every Beta, every Omega in that hall. For a moment, the artificial hierarchies my father has built seemed to dissolve. People remembered what they had lost, what had been taken from them. That's why he's so afraid." The sound of approaching footsteps made them both freeze. Multiple guards were coming down the corridor, their heavy boots echoing off the stone walls. Prince Kieran stepped back from the cell, his hand moving to the keys at his belt. "I have to go," he whispered. "But this isn't over. Your song has awakened something that's been sleeping for too long." "Wait," Lyra called softly as he prepared to leave. "Why are you helping me? You're his son, his heir. This could destroy everything you're meant to inherit." Prince Kieran paused in the shadows, and for a moment his carefully controlled mask slipped, revealing something raw and wounded beneath. "Because I remember what it felt like to have a mother who sang lullabies instead of battle hymns. Because I've spent 21 years wondering why her death left such a hole in the world. And because your song made me remember that I'm not just his son, I'm hers too." He vanished into the darkness, just as the guards rounded the corner, their torches casting long shadows down the corridor. They didn't seem to notice anything unusual, continuing their patrol with the bored efficiency of men performing routine duties. But Lyra remained standing at the bars of her cell, her heart racing with something that felt dangerously like hope. Prince Kieran's revelation changed everything. If Queen Elena had indeed been Omega, if she had passed the old songs to her son before her death, then the bloodline of ancient magic flowed through the royal family itself. The irony was almost too perfect. King Darius, who had built his reign on the suppression of Omega power, had married an Omega and fathered a son who carried their gifts in his very blood. As the guard's footsteps faded into the distance, Lyra began to hum softly, letting her voice carry through the stone walls to places where other Omegas might be listening. Tomorrow might bring her execution, but tonight she would sing the old songs, keeping the ancient traditions alive for one more dawn. And somewhere in the darkness above, she hoped, a prince was remembering his mother's lullabies and wondering what it might mean to be the bridge between two worlds. The Chapter 6. Blood and moonlight dawn came pale and cold through the narrow window slits of the castle's upper levels, but in the depths of the dungeons, time was measured only by the changing of the guards and the rhythm of Lyra's quiet singing. She had spent the night weaving melodies through the stone, sending comfort to other prisoners, and keeping the ancient music alive in what might be her final hours. The sound of many footsteps approaching made her fall silent. This wasn't the usual patrol or meal delivery. This was an escort come to take her to her execution. The dungeon master appeared first, a grizzled beta named Henrik, whose scarred face had seen decades of the king's justice. Behind him came 6 guards in full armor, their weapons gleaming in the torchlight. "Time to go, witch," Henrik growled, producing an ornate key to unlock her cell. "The king wants this done before the morning meal, nice and clean." They hauled her to her feet with little ceremony, the iron shackles making every movement agony. But as they prepared to march her through the corridors toward the courtyard, where executions were typically held, Lyra heard something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. The sound of running footsteps and shouted orders echoing from somewhere above. "What's that commotion?" one of the guards asked nervously. Henrik paused, his head tilted to listen. The sounds were growing closer, armed men moving quickly through the castle, voices raised in alarm or command. Something was happening, something that had disrupted the careful schedule of her execution. "Probably just a training exercise," Henrik said finally, but uncertainty colored his voice. "Come on, we have our orders." They had barely made it halfway up the winding stair from the dungeons when Prince Kieran appeared at the top landing, flanked by a dozen soldiers wearing his personal colors rather than the king's. His storm-grey eyes found Lyra immediately, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch, determination mixed with barely controlled fury. "Release the prisoner," he commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. Henrik's face went pale, but he stood his ground. "Your Highness, we have direct orders from the king. The Omega is to be executed for witchcraft. And I have direct orders from the Crown Prince of Lunaria," Kieran replied, stepping forward with predatory grace. "Release her now." The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The guards loyal to Prince Kieran had their hands on their weapons, while Henrik's escort looked nervously between the 2 sets of conflicting orders. Finally, Henrik made his choice, stepping aside with obvious reluctance. "Of course, Your Highness, though I should mention that the king specifically—" "The king," Prince Kieran said with deadly quiet, "is no longer in a position to give orders." The words hit the group like a thunderbolt. Henrik's mouth fell open, while several of the guards actually took a step backward. Lyra felt her knees go weak as the implications sank in. "What do you mean?" Henrik whispered. "I mean that King Darius has been declared unfit to rule by the Council of Alphas, effective immediately. His obsession with suppressing ancient bloodlines, his paranoid persecution of Omegas, his refusal to acknowledge the magical heritage that runs through our own royal family, it ends today." Prince Kieran moved down the stairs toward them, and Lyra could see something in his bearing that hadn't been there before. Where once he had carried himself with the controlled tension of a man bound by duty, now he moved with the confidence of someone who had finally chosen his path. "The Omega comes with me," he continued, reaching for the keys to her shackles. "She is under my protection now." "Your Highness," one of his soldiers said quietly, "your father has barricaded himself in the throne room with his most loyal guards. He's demanding to see you." Kieran's jaw tightened as he worked to free Lyra from the iron restraints. The moment the shackles fell away, she gasped in relief as the burning sensation faded, and she could feel her connection to the ancient power returning. "Let him demand," Kieran said. "He's had 21 years to explain why he killed my mother. I think I've waited long enough for answers." "He killed Queen Elena?" Lyra breathed, rubbing her raw wrists. "The wasting sickness was a lie," Kieran replied, his voice tight with long-suppressed rage. "I found the records hidden in his private chambers. She was poisoned slowly over months because she had begun using her Omega abilities to help heal the sick among our people. He couldn't risk word spreading that the Queen herself carried the bloodline he was trying to eradicate." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. King Darius had married an Omega for political reasons, perhaps not even knowing her true nature at first. But when Queen Elena had begun to embrace her heritage and use her gifts openly, he had seen her as a threat to everything he was building. The systematic oppression of Omegas hadn't just been policy, it had been personal. "The Council knows?" Lyra asked. "They know everything. It turns out that several of the most powerful Alpha families have Omega bloodlines in their recent ancestry. Lord Brennan's grandmother, Duchess Ravenna's great-aunt, at least a dozen others. My father's campaign of suppression has been slowly weakening the magical foundations of our entire society. They had reached the main level of the castle now, and Lyra could see clear evidence of the upheaval Prince Kieran had orchestrated. Servants huddled in doorways, whispering nervously among themselves. Guards loyal to the new regime moved through the corridors with purpose, while others had simply abandoned their posts entirely. The air itself felt different, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. "What happens now?" Lyra asked as they made their way toward the great hall. "Now," Prince Kieran said, pausing to look at her with those storm-grey eyes that reminded her so much of his mother's legendary compassion, "you help me teach our people what they've forgotten. The old songs, the ancient ways, the magic that flows through Omega bloodlines, all of it needs to be brought back into the light." "And your father?" Kieran's expression hardened. "My father will answer for his crimes, starting with the murder of my mother." As they approached the throne room, Lyra could hear angry voices raised in argument from behind the massive oak doors. King Darius was indeed making his last stand, surrounded by the few guards still loyal to his increasingly paranoid regime. But his time was ending, and everyone in the castle could feel it. Prince Kieran paused at the threshold, his hand on the door handle. "Are you ready for this?" he asked Lyra. "Once we walk through these doors, there's no going back. You'll be the first Omega to stand in the throne room as an equal rather than a servant. Your voice will help reshape this kingdom." Lyra thought of her mother's lullabies, of the ancient magic that had been suppressed for so long, of all the Omega servants who had lived and died in silence while their heritage was denied. She thought of Mira and the other Omegas still serving in the castle, still believing they were lesser beings, meant only for servitude. "I'm ready," she said, and her voice carried the strength of generations. Prince Kieran smiled, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, and pushed open the doors to face his father and claim his throne. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. The throne room of Castle Lunaria had witnessed centuries of royal proclamations, diplomatic negotiations, and declarations of war, but nothing in its long history had prepared it for the scene that greeted Lyra and Prince Kieran as they entered. King Darius stood behind the golden throne, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled and his golden eyes wild with desperation. Around him, perhaps 20 guards remained loyal, their weapons drawn but their faces uncertain as they faced twice their number of soldiers bearing Prince Kieran's colors. The massive chamber felt charged with tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Tapestries depicting the royal lineage hung from the walls, their golden threads catching the morning light streaming through tall stained glass windows. At the center of it all sat the throne itself, carved from a single piece of black oak and inlaid with silver representing the phases of the moon. It had been the seat of power for the Wolf Kings of Lunaria for over 300 years. "Kieran," King Darius's voice cracked as he spoke his son's name, "you don't understand what you're doing. That creature beside you, she's poisoned your mind with her witchcraft, just as your mother tried to poison mine." Prince Kieran stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Even without drawing the weapon, his presence commanded the room in a way his father's frantic energy could not. "Her name is Lyra, and she's not a creature. She's what you've been trying to destroy for 21 years. Living proof that Omega power still exists in this kingdom." "Omega power is a corruption," Darius snarled, his composure completely shattered. "It weakens the pack structure, undermines alpha authority, fills people's heads with dangerous ideas about equality and ancient magic. I've spent my entire reign building a stable hierarchy, and I won't let you tear it down for some romantic notion about your mother's bedtime stories." The mention of Queen Elena sent a visible tremor of rage through Prince Kieran's controlled facade. "My mother wasn't telling bedtime stories. She was preserving traditions that go back to the founding of this kingdom, traditions you murdered her for embracing." "I didn't murder anyone," Darius said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Elena died of illness. The physicians you bribed to falsify her death records," Kieran interrupted, pulling a rolled parchment from his jacket. "I found your correspondence with them, father. Payment schedules for their silence, detailed instructions on how to administer the poison, slowly enough that no one would suspect. You killed her because she started using her gifts to heal our people, and you were terrified they would realize their queen was Omega." Lyra watched the exchange with growing horror and fascination. She had known King Darius was cruel, but the cold calculation required to slowly poison his own wife revealed depths of evil she hadn't imagined. Beside her, she could feel Prince Kieran's fury building like a storm about to break. "She was making them weak," Darius shouted, his last shreds of royal dignity abandoning him entirely. Omegas singing their ancient songs, healing without proper medicine, filling people's heads with talk of magic and moon-blessed bloodlines. It was chaos. "I brought order to this kingdom." "You brought oppression," Kieran said coldly. "You built your order on the graves of innocent Omegas and the suppression of gifts that could have made our people stronger. Those gifts are an abomination. They undermine everything that makes us civilized." It was then that Lyra stepped forward, her voice cutting through the heated exchange like silver through silk. "If our gifts are so weak and meaningless, Your Majesty, why have you spent 2 decades trying so desperately to eradicate them?" All eyes in the throne room turned to her, and Lyra felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. But this time, instead of cowering under the scrutiny, she drew strength from it. She was no longer a terrified servant girl. She was the keeper of ancient traditions, the voice of generations of silenced Omegas. "You're afraid of us," she continued, moving closer to the throne with slow, deliberate steps. "You always have been, because deep down, you know that the power we carry is older and truer than the artificial hierarchies you've built. You know that when Omegas sing the old songs, when we remember who we really are, your entire system of control begins to crumble." "Silence," Darius screamed, drawing a jeweled dagger from his belt. "I won't listen to another word from you, witch." But Lyra didn't fall silent. Instead, she began to hum, the same lullaby she had sung at the banquet, the melody her mother had taught her in those final days before the world changed forever. The sound filled the throne room, reverberating off the stone walls and seeming to emanate from the very foundations of the castle. The effect was immediate and profound. Several of the guards loyal to Darius lowered their weapons, their faces softening as the music touched something deep within their memories. Even some of Prince Kieran's soldiers seemed moved by the haunting beauty of the ancient melody. But it was King Darius himself who was most affected. As Lyra's voice rose and fell with the familiar rhythms, his face went ashen and his hands began to shake. The dagger fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering on the marble floor. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. Elena used to sing that song." "Because it was her song," Lyra said gently, her voice carrying both melody and spoken words. "Because it was the song of her mothers and grandmothers, passed down through generations of Omega women who understood that true strength comes not from dominance, but from the bonds that connect us all." Prince Kieran moved to stand beside Lyra, and as he spoke, his voice seemed to harmonize with her continuing melody. "She sang it to me when I was frightened by thunder. She sang it to wounded soldiers in the castle's infirmary. She sang it to Omega servants who were homesick and afraid, and you killed her for it." "I had no choice," Darius said, his voice now barely a whisper. "The Council of Alphas was already questioning my strength. If they had discovered I had married an Omega, if they had realized our son carried that bloodline, they would have stripped us of the throne." "The same council that has now voted to remove you from power?" Prince Kieran asked with bitter irony. "The same council that has Omega ancestors of their own? You destroyed everything good in your life to protect yourself from a threat that existed only in your paranoid imagination." The truth of it seemed to break something fundamental in King Darius. He aged years in the space of seconds, his proud bearing crumbling as the weight of his crimes finally settled on his shoulders. Around the room, his remaining loyal guards began to set down their weapons, unable to continue defending a man who had admitted to murdering his Omega wife out of political fear. "What happens now?" Darius asked, his voice hollow and defeated. Prince Kieran exchanged a look with Lyra, and she saw in his storm-grey eyes the same question she had been asking herself. What did justice look like for crimes this vast? How did a kingdom heal from decades of systematic oppression? "Now," Kieran said finally, "you stand trial before the full Council of Alphas for the murder of Queen Elena and the persecution of Omega citizens throughout your reign. And now we begin the work of undoing the damage you've caused." Lyra's song finally faded to silence, but the resonance of it seemed to linger in the air, promising change and hope and the return of ancient magic to a kingdom that had forgotten its own heart. The Chapter 8. A New Dawn. 3 weeks after the confrontation in the throne room, Castle Lunaria buzzed with activity unlike anything it had seen in generations. The formal coronation of King Kieran was still 2 days away, but already the changes he had implemented were transforming daily life throughout the kingdom. Omega servants no longer skulked through corridors with downcast eyes. They walked with purpose and dignity, their voices heard in council meetings and their wisdom sought in matters both practical and mystical. Lyra stood in what had once been Queen Eleanor's private chambers, rooms that had been sealed and forbidden for over 20 years. Prince Kieran, soon to be King Kieran, had offered her apartments in the noble wing of the castle, but she had specifically requested these rooms. Here, surrounded by the belongings of the Omega Queen who had died for embracing her heritage, Lyra felt closest to the work she had undertaken. The chambers were magnificent, with tall windows overlooking the royal gardens and walls lined with books in languages both familiar and foreign. But it was the small personal touches that moved Lyra most deeply. A silver brush engraved with moon phases, pressed flowers preserved between the pages of poetry books, and most precious of all, a collection of handwritten songs that Queen Elena had been compiling before her death. She was creating a songbook, Lyra murmured to herself as she carefully turned the fragile pages. A collection of all the Omega lullabies and traditional melodies she could remember or discover. The work was incomplete. Perhaps a third of the pages remained blank, waiting for songs that would never be written. But what Elena had managed to preserve was invaluable. Melodies for healing, for calling rain during droughts, for easing the pain of childbirth, for strengthening the bonds between pack members. An entire magical tradition captured in musical notation and careful annotations. A soft knock at the door interrupted her research. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Mira or one of the other Omega women who had been helping her organize Queen Elena's belongings. Instead, Prince Kieran entered, carrying 2 steaming cups of tea and wearing the kind of simple clothes that had become his preference since taking power. The elaborate court costumes of his father's reign had been largely abandoned in favor of practical garments that didn't create unnecessary barriers between ruler and subjects. "I brought tea," he said with a slight smile. "You've been working in here for 12 hours straight. Even Omega magic has its limits." Lyra accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the fragrant steam of what smelled like jasmine and honey. "I keep discovering new things. Did you know your mother was corresponding with Omega scholars in the Eastern Territories? They were sharing traditional songs and trying to piece together the complete magical practices of our ancestors. The same Eastern Territories my father suppressed for their rebellious activities," Kieran said grimly, settling into a chair beside the desk where she worked. It wasn't rebellion, it was preservation. They were trying to keep alive the traditions he was determined to destroy. "The irony is breathtaking," Lyra agreed. "He created the very rebellion he feared by trying to eliminate the culture that bound Omega communities together." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, sipping their tea and watching the sun set over the royal gardens through the tall windows. It was a scene of such peaceful domesticity that Lyra sometimes had to remind herself it was real, that she truly was sitting in the Queen's chambers, planning the restoration of Omega rights with the man who would soon be crowned king. "There's something I need to discuss with you," Kieran said finally, his voice taking on the careful tone he used when approaching delicate subjects. "The coronation is in 2 days, and the Council of Alphas is expecting me to name my intended queen soon afterward." Lyra's stomach clenched, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. Of course he would need to marry, preferably to a high-ranking alpha or beta woman, who could help stabilize his new regime and produce heirs to continue the royal line. The fact that she had allowed herself to imagine any other possibility was foolishly romantic. "Have you made your choice?" she asked, proud of how steady her voice remained. "I have," he said, setting down his teacup and turning to face her fully. "But I'm not sure she'll accept." Before Lyra could ask what he meant, Kieran slid from his chair to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his with infinite gentleness. Her heart stopped as she realized what was happening. "Lyra," he said, his storm-grey eyes intense with emotion, "will you marry me? Will you be my queen and help me rebuild this kingdom on foundations of equality and ancient wisdom rather than oppression and fear?" The words hit her like a physical blow. "Kieran, you can't be serious. I'm Omega. The Council will never accept—" "The Council has already approved," he interrupted softly. "It took some discussion, But when I reminded them that Queen Elena was Omega and that our most prosperous years as a kingdom coincided with her influence, they began to see the wisdom in it. Several of them have Omega bloodlines themselves. They understand now that suppressing those gifts has weakened us all. But the political implications are exactly why this matters, Kieran said firmly. Marrying you sends a clear message to every Omega in the kingdom that they are valued, that their heritage is something to be celebrated rather than hidden. It shows everyone that the old hierarchies are truly changing. Lyra stared at him, her mind reeling. 3 weeks ago she had been a servant girl hiding her voice in castle kitchens. Now the man who would be king was proposing marriage, offering her not just love but a platform to help transform their entire society. I love you, Kieran continued, his voice soft but certain. Not because you're Omega, not despite being Omega, but because you're you. Because you had the courage to sing when the world demanded silence. Because you carry your mother's strength and your people's wisdom. Because when I look at you, I see the future this kingdom could have. The tears that had been building finally spilled over, and Lyra found herself laughing and crying simultaneously. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, of course yes. When he kissed her, she could taste the salt of her own tears mixed with joy so pure it felt like sunlight. This was what her mother's lullabies had been promising all along. Not just survival, but triumph. Not just endurance, but transformation. As they held each other in Queen Elena's chambers, surrounded by the preserved songs of generations past, Lyra began to hum softly. It was a new melody this time, one that seemed to flow directly from her heart, a song of hope and change, of love that could bridge any divide, of magic that could heal even the deepest wounds. Through the windows, the moon rose full and bright over the kingdom of Lunaria, casting its silver light on a land that was finally ready to remember what it meant to honor all its children, regardless of birth or bloodline. The Omega's song had become a queen's anthem, and the music of change echoed through every corner of the realm. Chapter 9. Crown of Silver and Song. The great hall of Castle Lunaria had been transformed once again, but this time the changes spoke of hope rather than oppression. Where King Darius had favored displays of wealth and dominance, the decorations for Kieran's coronation celebrated the natural beauty and ancient traditions of the kingdom. Branches of silver birch and flowering hawthorn created elegant arches, while hundreds of candles cast warm, dancing light across walls hung with tapestries depicting the old stories, not just the conquests of Alpha Kings, but the healing work of Omega Queens, the wisdom of Beta Counselors, and the harmony that came when all parts of the pack worked together. Lyra stood before a mirror in Queen Elena's former chambers, now officially hers, as Mira and 3 other Omega women helped her prepare for the ceremony. The dress they had created for her was unlike anything ever worn by a queen of Lunaria. Instead of heavy brocades and restrictive corsets, it flowed like liquid starlight, made from silk that had been woven with threads of actual silver to catch and reflect the light with every movement. The design honored both her Omega heritage and her new royal status, with embroidered moon phases along the sleeves and a crown of silver leaves that seemed to sing with gentle chimes whenever she moved. You look like something from the old stories, Mira whispered, her eyes bright with tears of joy, like the moon goddess herself come to earth. Through the tall windows, Lyra could see the crowds gathering in the courtyard below. Representatives from every corner of the kingdom had come to witness the coronation, but these weren't just the noble alphas and wealthy betas who had attended royal ceremonies in the past. Omega families who had never before been permitted at court stood alongside farmers and artisans, healers and scholars, all united in hope for what this new reign might bring. "Are you nervous?" asked Sarah, one of the older Omega women who had become part of Lyra's informal council of advisors. "Terrified," Lyra admitted with a laugh that held only the slightest tremor. 3 weeks ago I was scrubbing dishes in the kitchens. Now I'm about to be crowned Queen of Lunaria and expected to help reshape an entire kingdom. It feels impossible. Impossible things have a way of becoming inevitable when the right person decides to make them happen, Sarah said gently. Your mother would be so proud. A soft knock interrupted the final preparations, and Prince Kieran's voice came through the door. May I come in? I know it's traditionally unlucky to see the bride before the ceremony, but we're already breaking so many traditions, I thought one more wouldn't hurt. Lyra smiled, feeling some of her nervousness ease at the sound of his voice. Come in." He entered wearing the ceremonial robes of Lunarian royalty, but like everything else about the new regime, these had been modified to reflect changing values. The heavy golden crown of his ancestors had been replaced with a circlet of silver and moonstone, and his robes, while elegant, were cut for comfort and movement rather than intimidation. "You're beautiful," he said simply, his storm-grey eyes warm with love and admiration. "But more than that, you look like a queen. Not the kind of queen my father would have chosen, all political calculation and cold majesty, but the kind of queen this kingdom needs, someone who leads with both strength and compassion." "I hope I can live up to that," Lyra said, accepting the small bouquet of wildflowers he offered her, another break from tradition, as royal brides typically carried elaborate arrangements of exotic blooms. "You already have," Kieran replied. "The changes you've helped implement in just 3 weeks. Lyra, Omega children are attending school alongside Alpha and Beta children for the first time in 21 years. The healing centers you've established have already saved dozens of lives using traditional Omega medicine. The song circles you've organized have given people hope they'd forgotten how to feel." It was true. Working with Kieran and the Reformed Council, Lyra had thrown herself into the work of restoration with an energy that sometimes surprised her. Every day brought new challenges. Centuries of oppression couldn't be undone overnight, but also new victories. The first Omega appointed to a government position in generations. The first traditional healing ceremony performed openly in the capital. The first time the ancient songs had echoed through the castle halls as celebration rather than secret rebellion. "The council is waiting," Kieran said gently. "Are you ready to change the world?" Lyra thought of her mother's lullabies, of Queen Elena's unfinished songbook, of all the Omega women throughout history who had carried their traditions in secret, waiting for the day when they could sing freely again. She thought of Mira and Sarah and hundreds of others who were looking to her not just as their queen, but as proof that their voices mattered. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The procession to the Great Hall was unlike any in Lunarian history. Instead of the traditional silent march of nobles, it became a celebration of music and community. Omega voices rose in harmony with Beta melodies and Alpha harmonies, creating layered songs that seemed to make the very stones of the castle resonate with joy. Children scattered flower petals in their path, while elderly citizens who remembered the old ways wept openly to see traditions they thought lost forever being honored once again. The Great Hall fell silent as Lyra and Kieran entered together, another break from tradition, as they had chosen to approach the throne as equals rather than having her follow behind him. The assembled crowd rose as one, and Lyra felt the weight of their hopes and expectations like a physical force. High Counselor Brennan, now revealed as the descendant of Omegas himself, stood before the throne with the ceremonial crown and scepter. But these too had been modified for the new reign. The crown bore symbols representing all 3 bloodlines rather than just Alpha dominance, and the scepter was carved with musical notes representing the songs that would guide their rule. "Citizens of Lunaria," Brennan's voice carried clearly through the hall, "we gather today not just to crown a new king, but to celebrate the restoration of our kingdom's true heritage. For too long, we have allowed fear and prejudice to divide us, to silence the gifts that make our people strong. Today we choose a different path." The coronation ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity. Kieran knelt first, accepting the crown and the responsibility it represented to protect and serve all citizens, regardless of their birth. When he rose as king, his first act was to turn to Lyra with her own crown, not a queen consort's smaller circlet, but a crown equal in significance to his own. "Will you, Lyra of the Silver Voice, accept the crown of Lunaria and the responsibility to use your gifts in service of all our people?" Brennan asked formally. "I will," Lyra replied, her voice carrying clearly through the Great Hall, "and I swear by the ancient songs and the moonlight that guides us that I will work to ensure every voice in this kingdom is heard and valued." As the silver crown settled on her head, Lyra felt a resonance unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was as if every Omega song ever sung, every traditional melody ever preserved, every whispered lullaby ever passed from mother to daughter was suddenly flowing through her. The power was overwhelming and beautiful, connecting her not just to the living, but to generations of her ancestors who had kept the old ways alive through the darkest times. The hall erupted in cheers and applause, but underneath the celebration, Lyra could hear something else. The sound of hundreds of voices raised in the ancient songs, no longer hidden or whispered, but proclaimed proudly for all to hear. Chapter 10. The song Eternal 6 months had passed since the coronation, and the kingdom of Lunaria bore little resemblance to the oppressive realm King Darius had ruled. The changes were visible everywhere. In the mixed schools where Omega children learned alongside their Alpha and Beta peers, in the healing centers that combined traditional medicine with ancient Omega songs, in the government councils where representatives from all bloodlines worked together to solve the kingdom's challenges, Queen Lyra stood in the royal gardens on a warm summer evening, surrounded by the sound of laughter and music from the festival taking place in the courtyards beyond. The celebration of voices had become a monthly tradition, an opportunity for citizens to share their own songs and stories without fear of persecution or judgment. Tonight's festival was particularly special. It marked the official opening of the Royal Archive of Traditional Music, where Queen Eleanor's songbook had been completed and expanded with contributions from Omega communities across the kingdom. "You're smiling," King Kieran observed as he joined her among the flowering jasmine bushes, their white blooms releasing sweet fragrance into the warm night air. "I was thinking about how far we've come," Lyra replied, leaning into his embrace. 6 months ago, the idea of Omegas singing freely in the castle courtyards would have been unthinkable. Now listen. They stood together in comfortable silence, listening to the rich tapestry of sound drifting from the celebration. A group of Omega grandmothers was teaching traditional lullabies to a mixed audience of children, while nearby, a young Beta composer was collaborating with an Alpha musician and an Omega singer to create something entirely new. The boundaries between bloodlines hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had become permeable, allowing for the kind of cultural exchange that strengthened rather than divided. "The reports from the provincial governors are encouraging too," Kieran said, his tone shifting to the practical matters that still required their attention. "The Eastern Territories are finally stable now that their Omega communities have been officially recognized. The healing centers you established have reduced infant mortality by nearly 30%, and the agricultural programs combining traditional Alpha strength with Omega earth singing have produced the largest harvests in decades." "It's not perfect yet," Lyra acknowledged. "There are still communities where the old prejudices run deep, still families torn apart by years of enforced separation, but change is happening." "Speaking of change," Kieran said with a smile in his voice, "I have some news that might interest you." Before she could ask what he meant, a familiar figure emerged from the garden paths, Prince Marcus from the neighboring kingdom of Silvermoon, but he wasn't alone. Beside him walked a young woman with the distinctive silver-streaked hair that marked her as Omega nobility, her bearing proud and confident in a way that would have been impossible under the old regime. "Your Majesties," Prince Marcus said with a formal bow, "allow me to present my intended bride, Lady Celeste of House Moonwhisper. We've come to request your blessing on our union, and to formally invite you to attend our wedding ceremony." Lady Celeste curtsied gracefully, her grey eyes bright with intelligence and barely contained laughter. "Your Majesties, my intended, has heard much about the changes in Lunaria, and he's convinced his father to begin similar reforms in Silvermoon. It seems your revolution is becoming contagious." Lyra felt her heart soar with joy. When neighboring kingdoms began voluntarily adopting their reforms, it meant the changes they had fought for were truly taking root. "We would be honored to attend your wedding and to support Silvermoon's efforts toward equality." As Prince Marcus and Lady Celeste continued their visit with discussions of policy and tradition, Lyra found herself thinking about the ripple effects of their revolution. Every kingdom that embraced Omega rights, every community that rediscovered traditional songs, every child who grew up believing their voice mattered regardless of their bloodline, all of it stemmed from that terrifying night when she had been forced to sing for King Darius's cruel entertainment. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had chosen differently that night?" Kieran asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "If I had sung something designed to humiliate myself as your father intended, if I had chosen safety over truth?" Lyra considered the question seriously. "I think I would have died anyway, maybe not immediately but slowly, the way so many Omegas died under the old system. When you're forced to deny who you are, when you have to hide your gifts and silence your voice, something essential inside you withers away." "And now?" Lyra looked out over the gardens where dozens of people were enjoying the evening festival, their voices raised in songs that represented every tradition and bloodline in the kingdom. In the distance, she could see the lights of the capital city, where Omega children attended school, where traditional healers worked alongside trained physicians, where the old hierarchies had given way to something richer and more complex. "Now I sing every day," she said simply. "In council meetings when we need wisdom, in the healing centers when people are hurting, in our private chambers when you're worried about difficult decisions, the song that nearly got me killed has become the foundation of everything we've built." A new sound drifted from the festival, young voices raised in harmony, creating something she had never heard before. It was clearly based on one of the traditional Omega lullabies, but it incorporated melodic elements from Alpha war songs and the mathematical precision of Beta compositions. It was something entirely new, a musical fusion that could only exist in a world where all voices were valued. "Listen," Lyra whispered, her eyes filling with happy tears. "They're creating new traditions, taking the old songs and making them into something that belongs to everyone." Kieran squeezed her hand gently. "Your mother would be so proud." "Our mothers," Lyra corrected, thinking of Queen Elena's unfinished songbook and the legacy of love and sacrifice that had made their current happiness possible. Both of them. They preserved what they could, hoped for what they couldn't see, and trusted that someday their daughters and sons would finish what they started. As if summoned by their conversation, a figure appeared at the garden entrance. Mira, now serving as the royal coordinator of Omega affairs, her face glowing with excitement. "Your Majesties," she called softly, not wanting to interrupt if they were engaged in important discussions. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's something at the festival you need to see." They followed Mira back toward the main courtyard, where the crowd had formed a large circle around a group of performers. But as they drew closer, Lyra realized these weren't professional entertainers. They were ordinary citizens, people from all walks of life and all bloodlines, who had spontaneously come together to create something beautiful. At the center of the circle stood a young Omega girl, perhaps 8 years old, her clear soprano voice leading the group in a song that seemed to weave together every musical tradition Lyra had ever heard. Around her, Alpha voices provided deep harmony, Beta voices added intricate counter-melodies, and other Omega voices created responses that turned the performance into a living conversation. But it was the words that took Lyra's breath away. The child was singing a new song, one that told the story of a kingdom that had learned to value all its children, of voices that had been silenced and then restored, of the power that came when people chose love over fear. "She wrote it herself," Mira whispered, her voice full of wonder. "Her name is Anna, and she's one of the first Omega children to attend the integrated schools. She says the song came to her in a dream." As the performance reached its climax, with hundreds of voices joining in the final chorus, Lyra felt the same resonance she had experienced during her coronation, the sense of connection to something larger than herself, to the long chain of Omega women who had preserved their traditions through the darkest times, and to the bright future that was even now being born. The song ended in a moment of perfect silence, and then the entire courtyard erupted in cheers and applause. But as the celebration continued around them, Lyra found herself humming softly. Not one of the traditional songs, not the melody that had started their revolution, but something new, something that belonged entirely to this moment and this joy. "What's that?" Kieran asked, recognizing that he had never heard this particular melody before. "Tomorrow's lullaby," Lyra replied, one hand resting unconsciously on her still flat stomach, where the earliest signs of new life were just beginning to make themselves known. "The song I'll sing to our children, so they'll grow up knowing that every voice has power, that love can overcome any fear, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to be silent." As the moon rose full and bright over the kingdom of Lunaria, Queen Lyra's voice joined the eternal song that connected all living things, the music of hope, of change, of love, triumphant over hatred. It was a song that would echo through generations, carried in the hearts of Omega children who would never know oppression, Alpha children who would never learn cruelty, and Beta children who would never accept that any voice was less valuable than their own. The Omega's song had become the kingdom's anthem, and it would play forever.